I'm from Adelaide originally, and I went to Blackfriars Priory School, which was in the north part of Adelaide, but my family home was in Tea Tree Gully, and I really had a great desire to join the Navy as soon as I possibly could. And when I joined the Navy in 1978, there was a junior recruit scheme, so I joined when I was 15, going on to 16, and I don't think you're allowed to do that anymore with the UN Convention of Child Soldiers, but that was the process at the time, and went to school basically initially, and then from there I just did all my recruit training, and then off into the Navy proper after that. So I spent 21 years in the Navy, and enjoyed pretty much all of it. It was pretty good. And my father was in the Army, but I did have an uncle in the UK that was in the Navy, and I got to hear about him travelling around, and it sounded pretty interesting. I have 3 brothers, and all of my brothers joined the Navy after I did. So there was, my the 4 brothers, the 4 Apperley brothers, were all in the Navy at the one time, or there at one stage. So it was fairly interesting. Yeah. We went over to Perth at HMAS Lewin, which is now an Army barracks, I think. But that was the junior recruit training establishment. So, yeah, pretty much spent the first part of my time there, and then graduated, and then off to HMAS Cerberus, which is where most sailors do their initial training before getting off to posted out to the Navy proper. I was what they call a stores naval, which was in a supply area, and so I did my training, my specialisation training there. Basically, our role is to provide the logistics aspects of not only shore bases but also ships at sea, which covers a range of commodities from aircraft parts through to basically the food that's on the ship, and making sure we account for it, and make sure the endurance of the ship is loaded correctly, so that we could disappear for 6 months and make sure that we could get back again. You would normally do 4 years on a shore posting and then 2 years at sea, so you would go through that sort of cycle. That's reduced a lot now. There's more sea time, for various reasons, but because they've commercialised a lot of the shore-based postings. So when you went to sea, you could be out there just what we used to call weekly running, so go out for the week and back in on the weekend. Or you could disappear on a 6-month deployment, and we would head up to Southeast Asia, or different parts of the Pacific, and we'd be gone from our home port, which in my case was Sydney, for anywhere between 4 to 6 months at a time. It's great, just a bit of an adventure at the start, but then you sort of got to work out why we were doing the things that we were doing, and every day was something different, and it's a great life while you're single, and then after that you have to just sort of try and compromise a little bit, because when you were single, going to sea was all you wanted to do, but after you got married, then you have to sort of try and get a few shore postings to spend a bit of time at home. I got married when I was 20, and my wife and I just celebrated our 40th wedding anniversary just recently, so she come along the journey with me most of the way, so it's pretty good. I was Chief Petty Officer I was Stores Accounting Officer at HMAS Penguin in Sydney, and one of my old bosses rang me up, Lieutenant Tim Marr, and asked me if I was interested in going on a deployment. We'd just spent some time together, a couple of years together on HMAS Parramatta, and we'd both come ashore. And he rang me up and said, "Would you be interested?" And I said, "Yeah." I didn't know what it was, but he was on the news already. Somalia was quite prevalent in the news at that time because of Operation Restore Hope and various other activities that were going on. I said to him, "Yeah, what do I have to do?" And he sent me all the documentation and various bits and pieces. Had a chat with my boss, had a chat with my CO, and they said, "Yep, no worries at all. If you get selected to go, then you can go." So that's what I did. There was a very small contingent of Navy folks. There was probably about 6 or 7 of us at the time. We were given in the Navy it was slightly different. When you go on a deployment, everybody goes, and we just get told shortly before we're leaving where the main places that we were going to. This massive document in my eyes was came. It was a pre-embarkation instruction. Be here, do this, do that, do this. This is where you pick up your uniforms and various other bits and pieces. I got that in the internal mail one day. I was told to report to Reinforcement Holding Company at Randwick, which was only down the road from where I lived. I lived at Maroubra, so I could actually almost see it from my house. We just spent our initial period of time there. I think it was a couple of weeks, just getting to know everybody, bit of team building, getting a bit of situation awareness of what the country was like, what was happening out there, and also our rules of engagement, that type of thing when we were there. Meeting up with the Air Force contingent and also the Army contingent folks. Doing a bit of PT, which was a bit unusual for us in the Navy, just a bit of more team building and familiarisation with where we were heading, and did that for a couple of weeks, and then we were just waiting for our dates to then be sent off to the airport basically, and get over there into Somalia. I suppose the late May 93 to June timeframe, things started to deteriorate quite a bit over there, and it was starting to get on the news quite a lot. And there was an incident, I can't remember the date, but there was about 20 to 25 Pakistani soldiers were killed as in an engagement in theatre, and that was sort of very much in the forefront of our minds as we were sort of getting ready to go. But they were telling us that the situation was starting to get a bit more challenging because the locals were sort of reacting to some of the the forces and things that were on the ground in particularly in Mogadishu, which is where we were going. We were still getting reports back of a little bit of banditry here and there, but fundamentally we didn't really know what we were getting ourselves into, to be quite honest. So a bit unusual for Navy folks to go to an airport, to leave their family behind for, I think we thought we were going to be over there for about 6 months. So not that unusual for us, to do that, but to actually go to an airport and do that was a bit of a novel thing for us. We flew out of Sydney. We met up with the contingent, went through security, immigration, customs and immigration, and then just started sort of getting our thoughts together. Flew over to Perth, and then from Perth to Harare in Zimbabwe, and just overnighted there, which was a bit of an interesting place to go. First time I'd stepped foot in Africa. I'd always spent most of my time sort of in the Pacific or up in Southeast Asia. So overnight in Zimbabwe, and then from Zimbabwe into Nairobi, and then spending a couple of days in Nairobi just acclimatising, working out who was doing what, and then getting a UN chartered flight into Mogadishu with a bunch of UN civilians, as well as the Australian contingent that was going in on that particular day, which was very interesting because part of the process of us getting over there was we had to carry some weapons with us. So getting those onto aircraft and getting them off was a little bit interesting. But once we got onto this, we got onto what they call an L-100, which is a civilian version of a Hercules, the old Hercules aircraft. Got on board the aircraft and then started sort of buckling up and sitting down and, getting basically told what we were going to be doing as soon as we got to the other end. And then started, the reality of it all was starting to put the weapon together. We had it in a few pieces just so we could get through what we needed to get to. And then just waiting for I think it was about an hour's flight from Nairobi into Mogadishu. And then, you could see the civilians on the other side, which had come from all over the world to sort of help out there, realising that maybe they were sort of going into somewhere as well that was not quite, as stable as what people might have made it out to be. The flight in was pretty straightforward. Aircraft landed, taxied through to the UN had an apron, an area where they parked their aircraft, and the movement control unit at the airport was Australian, and with some Kiwis who were helping unload the aircraft and do some of the supply work. Met us on the ramp. The ramp come down, the heat hits you, and then the juices start flowing because you're sort of not really sure what you're up to. Straight away there was somebody that spoke like us, met us, and basically ushered us off the aircraft and got us all formed up and ready for the next part of the journey, which was the getting on the vehicle and transported through the streets. And that's when a lot of it hits you. You can see that the place has been completely destroyed, and the lawlessness, and once you go outside that gate at the airport, you're basically in Dodge City. It's like the Wild West, and those sort of things certainly for a Navy person, very, very confronting for me at the time, and not really knowing, what I was getting myself into. But the fact that we were all there, with people that had been there and, knew what to tell us what to do, sort of calmed us down a bit, and then off we went. Drove, I think it was about maybe not more than 10 Ks, maybe 7 Ks up to where we were staying, which was the old US Embassy compound. It had been completely destroyed, and they were in the process of trying to sort of put it back together so that people could start functioning in there. Disembarking from the vehicle, and then meeting up with the rest of the contingent, and being given a what they call an MRE, a meal ready to eat. So right, there's your lunch, have that, and then just work out from there what jobs we were going to do, swapping our weapons over, because we had pistols, we were picking up our rifles, so we swapped over our weapons, and worked out where we were going to sleep for the night, and did all that sort of thing, and then got a bit of an in-country sort of briefing, so that we sort of had a bit of a situational awareness of sort of what had been happening over the previous couple of weeks. Catching up with a few folks that we hadn't seen for a while, because the advance party that we did some of our training with, and then basically just settling into where we were staying, which was an old garage, which was commandeered, which was the Australia House, which was commandeered by the Australian contingent, and then because it was a reasonably solid structure, and there was a bunch of concern around mortar attack and small arms fire and various other bits and pieces. So I think that's why they located themselves into this particular building. By the time I'd got there, there was the last probably maybe dozen people remained behind, just to do a bit of a handover, and then they left pretty much at the end of the following week. So I think it was less than that. Actually, it was probably about 3 or 4 days later. I think they were ready to go. They just wanted to get out of there. My role that I was allocated was the quartermaster. So based on my relevant experience, that was the job that I was given. So I was the ASC2 quartermaster, and my role was just to make sure that all the equipment and we were able to sustain ourselves and ensure that we had enough access to the UN supply system, so that we could function inside the environment there. So during the day, there was a bit of a presence on the streets generally when we first got there. So generally moving around in the streets and things, as long as you looked a bit as though you meant business. The Australian uniform was well recognised by the locals. The battalion had done a fantastic job up in Baidoa and around that sector. And word of mouth, I think, is that the Australians weren't, people that would go out of their way to make your life difficult. So having the uniform, certainly the Australian uniform on, was, I think, the locals didn't mess with us as much as they would with some of the other contingents. A routine day for us would be, it didn't happen every day, but most days, as soon as the sun would go down, the locals would, they used to chew this thing called cat. It was like some sort of drug that they'd get onto, and they would get a bit brazen towards the end of the day. The compound that I was in was secured by a Tunisian contingent, and there would be concrete wall, and then shipping container, concrete wall, where a hole had been punched through the main perimeter wall. So they'd fill the gaps with shipping containers, and they were pretty good targets for rocket-propelled grenades. I think the locals thought that was cool, because if you hit one with an RPG, it would make a nice mess. And during the evening, the Somalis would try and either penetrate the compound or fire mortars or RPGs over in the fence. So there would be gunfire most nights from in both directions, and on more often than not, there would be a bit of mortar fire and RPG fire into the compound from the outside as well. The contingent, the United Nations contingent used to set up, a few posts around to, try and, I think there was a couple of sniper positions set up to try and stop some of that sort of activity. There was a bit of drive-by activity as well. So that was pretty much an evening. You knew things were getting a little bit too close when you could smell the cordite from the actual mortars. So that was a regular occurrence. I think they were just making a nuisance of themselves most of the time. As our time went on over there, they got a bit more brazen. They were becoming a bit more, this was sort of just opportunistic, I think, in a lot of instances. But back towards the back end of the process, they were getting better organised, and they were actually, coming up with different ways of disrupting and creating havoc inside the organisation, inside the city itself, and within the compound as well. Indeed, as time marched on, and they were getting better organised and being a bit more brazen, they were stopping us from doing things, particularly moving around with inside of vehicles, and for a period of time there, the only way we could actually get around the place was through travelling in helicopters. So that changed the dynamic very, very much. And then they made a determination that they needed to reduce the amount of time that they were moving through the built-up areas. So they built a road. They actually built a road around the city back to the seaport and the airport, which were the main areas where we were needing to travel. So they did affect the force eventually. They were doing certain things that you certainly weren't expecting. We didn't have any armoured vehicles. All our vehicles were soft-skin vehicles, and so we were not quite prepared for what was actually occurring over time. The Australian contingent really only had soft-skin vehicles while I was there, but some parts of the UN force, the Pakistani battalion and the Malaysian battalion, and I think there were some Egyptian APCs there, but we rarely travelled in those vehicles. Yeah. We had a few working for us, and we were, I think it's part of the Australian sort of psyche to naturally want to interact with the folks that we're over there with. We would try and pick up a bit of their language. We'd try and speak to them, in their native language as best we could, which we probably butchered. But the other thing was that we, had a good rapport with some of the locals that were working in and around our compound, and they were very, very appreciative of what was being done for them. Indeed, on many occasions, a lot of them would ask how they could, migrate to Australia. I think that was because of they saw the way we sort of treated each other and that type of thing. I would go to the seaport in my specific role probably once or twice a week. Yeah. So yeah, that was I'd definitely be outside the wire, maybe 3 or 4 times a week. Yeah. to either to the airport or the seaport. We basically had a Land Cruiser with usually myself and two others, usually the whoever was available on the day, and we would just get kitted up. If we could find a couple of extra flak jackets, we'd throw those on the floor in the vehicle as well, sit on them, wear our helmet, wear our flak jacket, and just get out in the street and off we go. Our boss, Lieutenant Colonel Jones at the time, he always used to say to us at night orders, you got to, when you go out there, look mean, do your best. So, it was, not trying to intimidate the locals, but trying to just make sure that they understood that if something did happen, we would mean business. It was a fairly basic accommodation, just a concrete building with a, I think it had a bit of a concrete roof with a bit of galvanised iron sort of sitting over the top of it. None of the windows were in it. They'd either been stolen or smashed. None of the wiring was actually in the building. All the copper wire, all the electrical cables, those types of things were all removed. And I think potentially either used by the locals or sold off. No power, so we had a couple of generators, and we had to travel about maybe 300 metres for a shower, and we had a couple of what they call chuffers set up. Never seen one before, get in the middle of Mogadishu, and the army have these things called chuffers, which are basically your toilets, but it actually it incinerates or burns whatever the waste is, and you have to light the chuffer in the morning, sort of thing. So lost a few eyebrows, not being too skilled in that area. But the building was sort of set up in a fairly open area, which we used to use for a bit of a recreation area, and then all of the little hidey holes, down the rest of the building were sort of sectioned off, and that's where we set up our cots and our bunks and various other bits and pieces. Our trunk that we brought with us was basically under our bunk. We had the mozzie nets, and we had the usual what you certainly expect in a place that doesn't really have any sanitation and any of that sort of thing. A lot of rats running around the place. Rats used to knock off our rat traps. They were so big, so they'd disappear off down, and we'd collect the rat trap down another part of the compound after the rat had taken it. We mainly sort of from a sort of subsistence perspective, we had a stash of ration packs, and our main source of food was a Norwegian field kitchen, and that was set up, for most of the UN contingent to access for meals. We went big on fish and cheese, which is basically what they served up most meals. It didn't matter whether you went down there for breakfast or lunch or tea. There was the same hot cheese with holes in it, and fish, not cooked sometimes, and very, very quickly the guys and the girls were sort of not really impressed with the food, so we sort of arranged our own. We organised our own meals. We built ourselves a barbecue area, and in the end we started basically looking after ourselves, because the food that was being provided by the UN in that first couple of months that I was there was making people ill, and various other bits and pieces. So we just decided amongst ourselves that we were going to look after that ourselves. So we did. So yeah.
How do you do that? So where do you get your food from?
We just made friends with there was an American company called Brown and Root in theatre, providing accommodation and services for the US Army, and we got friendly with a couple of the chefs there, and we started eating quite well. We also had access to the supply battalion, the New Zealand supply battalion, and they were managing all the food as it came in and out. So yeah, we would go down, in talking about how many trips to the seaport. A lot of the trips to the seaport were to either pick up passengers or go down and pick up food that we were going to, make ourselves. So yeah, it's interesting. So there was a lot of quite a bit of card playing. In typical Australian fashion, there was a lot of annoying each other, and but we had we set up a bit of a basketball court outside. So whenever we could, we'd go and have play a bit of basketball. Eventually, as we started to get a bit more sophisticated, we started building some gym equipment and various things. We had a bit of a gymnasium sort of set up eventually, and really of an evening, the general routine was come back. We'd tell everybody when the barbecue was on or whatever we were making for tea that night, and people would sort of make their way back, except for the people that were on duty. And then we'd have a nightly orders from the regimental sergeant major or from the COMASC, the commander of the Australian contingent. So we'd get a bit of a sit rep, we'd get a bit of an intel brief, those types of things. Work out what we were doing the next day, if there was any sort of people coming in that we needed to know about, whether there was any dignitaries coming or, different activities, and basically going through that process of an evening, which was a great thing to do because it sort of got us all back together during the day, and we had a bit of a chat, and somebody would want a hand doing something or various other bits and pieces. So yeah, it was good. It was a nice, sort of, just I would call it quality time, sort of. Yeah, yeah, just for an hour or two. And then go off and do your own thing. We had our own Australian Forces post office, which was AFPO 6, I think it was. I probably got their number wrong. Where we could write, and the contingent financial advisor used to run the post office, so we could send mail, and we could have mail delivered to us. I think that being in the Navy, contact back with home was never really a big thing. We'd write a couple of letters every now and again. We didn't have the internet, or we didn't have any phone contact and various other bits and pieces like that. So, for us, for some people it was a big problem because they just didn't have that sort of connection back to home. But most contact back from back home to Australia was through writing letters, basically. And we were allowed I think it was a 10-minute phone call using the satellite phone a month, and that was pretty much all the contact that we had back with home. We were allowed to take a couple of weeks off during the deployment. Some people would go back to Australia for that period of time. I went over to London, and I met up with some family. My wife came over, and I've got some relatives in the UK, so I spent my couple of weeks off in the UK. Yeah, and
was that midway or late?
Mine was sort of towards the back end because we had to stagger the process. So I sort of took mine about 2/3 of the way through the deployment. I think the people that went back to Australia had more difficulty. I definitely think that probably a trick that I learned in the Navy, you know, if you're going to go away, go away. You know, don't go away for a couple of weeks and come home, because you not only get in trouble for messing up the routine in the house, but you know, you're sort of connecting and disconnecting, you know, like more often than not. So being in the Navy, for me, it was, my wife even would say it was much better to, you know, you don't want to be away for massive periods of time, but it was much better from a stability perspective to be away for, you know, the duration and then, you know, come home. So I noticed the folks that went back to Australia, some of them had a bit more difficulty when they got back. For me, it was just, you know, I mean, I think by the time I'd been on leave or been on R&R and came back, I knew that I'd only had about a month to go, so it wasn't, you know, it wasn't such a big deal. We were part of the Australian Service contingent, but I was part of the Joint Movement Control Unit. So our job was to run all of the road, the air and the sea movements, manage those aspects of the United Nations deployment into Somalia. A very small team of people, but a big job. Because, you know, we were there over a period of time where there was a lot of rotations. You know, there was certainly the French and rotation coming in, the Foreign Legion, you know, rotation coming in from Djibouti. There was a massive Indian presence, sort of about 2/3 of the way through our deployment. That had to rotate in and then get them out to, you know, the parts of the country where they needed to go. And obviously just the resup through the airhead and also the resup through the seaport. So our role was to coordinate all of that and make sure that, you know, when contingents needed to move inside of the area, that it was sort of done in a controlled and, you know, organised fashion. I think my view on the role that we played was that the stabilisation of the country did occur initially, and then there was basically a drawdown from, you know, the bigger national contingencies. And what I saw in my time over there was that yes, the food aid and, you know, the things that was initially to try and you know, help the people of Somalia not only stabilise and get out of a civil war sort of situation, but also to make sure that the people of Somalia were being fed and the food was getting out to where it needed to, because what was happening was the Warlords would all, you know, be controlling all of that, and it was only going to where they wanted it to go. So definitely saw some improvement in that space. However, I saw a very gradual, and towards the end it was a rapid decline of the security situation, and the country was starting to basically return back to a fairly lawless, and infrastructure was very poor. We were over there during the infamous Black Hawk Down. You know, I think everybody's probably seen the movie, but we were there when that was happening, and that was just a sign of how the locals, particularly the ID clan, had started to get on the front foot with the UN and all the other nation contingents, and start being offensive towards, you know, taking an offensive posture towards the UN forces. And, you know, obviously everybody knows that there was, you know, quite a lot of people killed over that 2 or 3 days. probably overnight really. Helicopters were shot down, tanks were out in the streets, and who knows what the number of Somalis that were killed. The official figure and what actually occurred is probably nowhere near what's been reported, but it was quite a significant deterioration, and that was certainly a trigger point in the whole of the deployments, and certainly had a major impact on the subsequent deployments of how the Australian contingents were prepared, and we were definitely lucky that we didn't have any significant casualties. We had people that were suffering from, I think they called it, battle fatigue as a result of some of the incidents that were occurring. But definitely, to answer your question, the situation deteriorated pretty much, and I saw it declining the whole time that I was in Somalia. We would have to adopt a more offensive posture inside the compound, and whenever there was instances where the compound was breached, and we would go to a stand to situation. The mortar attacks started to increase. I spent a little bit of time down at with the New Zealand contingent at the airfield. The locals were starting to try and mortar the aircraft on the inside the airfield. We'd have to jump into bunkers and that type of thing. So it definitely wasn't getting any better as we were leaving. We didn't really have good exit strategies for the contingent, but as a result of how the security situation was deteriorating, they started putting a bit more planning into how the contingent, the subsequent contingents were going to be looked after, and in the end they ended up bringing an SAS troop in to protect the Australian contingent because things started to deteriorate that badly. I think the UN were very pleased with having the Australians there doing the movement control activities. We're fairly well organised. A lot of the contingents were not as well organised, particularly depending on what part of the nation pool that they came out of at the time. So I think they were happy to have a fairly strong, well organised, disciplined team of people that could make things happen. So we did have a lieutenant colonel psychologist come in theatre, and that was another trip out to pick him up, and he came through and just had a bit of a in theatre debrief with us prior to coming home, which excuse me, which was quite useful actually. And he, just sort of stepped us through a few things, and I think that was a good thing that the Army did to make sure that people, when they return back home, that they'd had at least an opportunity to, have a chat with, a psychologist, which was good. Yeah.
Was it group debrief or one?
No, he did. Well, certainly for me, it was an individual, an individual debrief, which I did speak to him when I got home as well. He sort of followed up with a call after we got back. It was a bit of an adjustment period getting back. You're always running at this heightened sense of, you're in some sort of parallel universe almost, of, everything seems to be, just in this high level of tension. And then you know, in the Navy, it always used to take us a couple of weeks to get home right after we'd been somewhere. But you get on a flight, you do a couple of hops, and you're flying into Sydney 2 days later, and there's your family, and you know, you're sort of trying to get back into this society that's you've been out of for a little while. And you know, doors slamming, and you know, cars backfiring, and those types of things. You know, took you a little. You know, you start to duck and, you know, do a few crazy things, and but after a while, you know, you just sort of settle back in and sort of try and do your best, get back on with it. It's quite weird, actually. You don't understand the inherent danger probably while you're there, but then, you know, you should, but you start to think about it, and then you know, for us, you know, I don't think any level of sort of preparation can always get you, you know, ready for the, you know, what you're about to experience. But you know, the Army certainly try to do their very best to get you situated as much as you possibly can as you get into theatre. And you know, getting home and just looking back and thinking, well, you know, wow, you know, that could have gone really badly, you know, but it didn't. And maybe that was our training. Maybe that was just, you know, luck. You know, I was over there when, you know, people such as the Morris Catering Group were there. One of his sons got executed while I was there. You know, so, you know, just it's a game of inches. You know, some days we would have transited through a particular area, and then 15 minutes later, a massive, you know, command detonated explosion, or somebody having a go at you with a small arms fire. You know, it's just the luck of the draw sometimes, I think. My general view on this is that there was a lot of brave folks, you know, deployed as right the way through this whole Somalia experience, particularly in the Australian Service Contingent associated with the Movement Control Unit. You know, I think the reason why we managed to get out, you know, without, you know, too much, you know, difficulty was because we all worked very well together. Sometimes the training kicks in, sometimes the adrenaline kicks in, sometimes the panic kicks in. But you know, I think if I was going to single out anybody, I think it would be Pete Evans, the RSM, for the time when I was there. A guy called Norm Marr, who was the RSM that replaced Pete in ASC 3. And those guys, you know, were there to look after us and make sure that we were as safe as we possibly could, and they did a pretty good job.